Back viewers to this very interesting podcast on a health segment of the entire series that we'll be conducting in the next coming podcast. Uh, I have been joined by Smitashree Mishra. She is a public health professional with experience and expertise in advocacy, strategic communication, and policy analysis. She has worked closely with multiple stakeholders in India and Africa on a range of public health issues. Currently, she is a manager at an international public health a firm that spearheads projects and campaigns engaging global and local audience focused on improving health and well-being. So she's a well-read person in this health segment. In the entire podcast, we will be talking about the pandemic years and post-pandemic things that we have been witnessing over the horizon. And there has been more debate on the entire and healthcare issues. It has got prioritized before, after especially this pandemic just receded. Most of the things have now fallen in line, and we have just tried to get back to the work offline mood, and it's no more that much strictly work from home scheme or work from home culture. First of all, I'd like to and just welcome her on the podcast. Welcome on the podcast, Smitashri.
Thank you so much, Mehraj, and thanks for your kind words. I look forward to an engaging conversation on this topic.
Thanks that you joined us on a very short notes because I was planning to have this conversation, I guess, next week, but the time lag was there. So we just zeroed in on this and you finally joined me. So just tell me that this entire narrative and discourse that's they're getting, that is becoming so important and healthcare is becoming so prioritized, especially this post-pandemic world that we are part of. I mean, there are people who are not with us. There are people who have got serious side effects of this entire. If everybody literally has got COVID at an average, but then we got vaccines. We again are seeing the light of the happiness, and we are joined by all the people who suffered massive losses. So, as humans, we still are worth celebrating this entire unison and entire unity that we showed all across this pandemic. So, what are your thoughts on this entire public health that has got prioritized because of this pandemic?
Thank you for a question, Mehraj. And I think before going into before diving deep into this conversation as to how public health has become a priority, and discussing what are the learnings from COVID, I think it's very important at the outset to just highlight as to why we are discussing this today and how is this discussion sort of significant given that we are, as you said, kind of getting into a normalcy phase where we are no longer wearing masks, there's no travel restrictions, and countries seem to not have any lockdowns except for China. So, why exactly do we need to discuss this? I feel now is the time when countries, global health leaders, and organizations are kind of looking back at or revisiting their health strategies, looking at what can be done to recover from the loss that the programs and the schemes have gone through because of the pandemic. And hence, it is important to address or answer three questions. What were the gaps? Why were the gaps? And what are we doing to mend the gaps? I think that's exactly what we are kind of going to discuss in this podcast. Now, slowly moving into your question as to how healthcare has become a priority for not only India, but it has become or has come into the mainstream discussion across the globe. Now, if you actually track down to say 11th of March 2020, when World Health Organization actually announced coronavirus outbreak as a global pandemic, to now we have lost 6.5 million people or even more. These are just the recorded number of cases. So I think it seems like we had to lose that many number of people for health sector to become a priority for the country or the globe as such. So it's while the pandemic sort of gave us a horrific 2 to 3 years of experience where we had to go through a lot of people lost a lot of things, and people went through a lot of emotional struggle as well. It was a traumatic experience for all, but at the same time, we must acknowledge that the pandemic has elevated healthcare to the forefront as a priority. And we see a lot of initiatives being taken, we see a lot of discussions happening, and all of them are kind of stemming from the learnings that we have gotten from the pandemic. So yes, the pandemic was a bad phase for us, but it definitely gave us a lot of learnings. If I have to count, there are like probably hundreds of learnings that we have from COVID-19, but if I have to specifically mention, and choosing from the top five, it would be number one is it is remarkable how the different pieces of the puzzles came together. All the stakeholders came together, the global stakeholders, the governments, the private sector, philanthropies, media, government, and most importantly, the community came together to fight for a common vision or common goal, that is to reduce the COVID-19 cases. And that is something that we are trying to sort of replicate in all our other health issues as well, to have a unified vision, to have a unified mission. So that's how probably one of the key learnings of COVID-19 has helped in prioritizing health as a topic of discussion in most of the policymaking agenda. The second thing that COVID has probably taught us is vaccine manufacturing or drug development. It is remarkable how in 326 days we managed to move from a genome sequencing to actually moving to authorization of a COVID-19 vaccine. So it has set the benchmark way too high now. Now we can't come up with an excuse that we do not have vaccines for ancient diseases that have been with us for so many decades now. Now is the time to act. And if we could do it for COVID-19, we can do it for diseases like, say, TB or filaria. That is predominant in India. I think the third learning that we can take from COVID is, again, a subpoint of vaccine manufacturing or drug development. That is the amount of iniquity that we saw during the vaccine manufacturing and distribution phase, especially take the example of Africa. While Africa was struggling to give the first dose of vaccines to its people, United States of America was actually giving booster shots after giving 2 shots of vaccines to its people. So it just shows that there is vaccine inequity, and we need to develop our own skills and our manufacturing capabilities so that we do not solely depend on other countries or global institutions for help. And another major learning that, of course, is being discussed a lot now is investment in public health and innovation in public health. So COVID-19 showed us how a lot of initiatives were taken in a short period of time through public and private partnership, and how similar efforts can be replicated in different health sectors or in different health issues as well. So I think these are primarily the key learnings from COVID, which has resulted in healthcare being a part of our daily discourse, a priority in the policy making and development agenda. So which is a good thing, but it took us a lot of time, I guess, to come to this.
That's
Back to
very
you, Mehraj.
depth and analysis of the entire thing. But when we look at the entire last 3-4 years, we have seen that healthcare there is no denying the fact that it has come to a point where no government or no state can afford to actually put it at the second spot. It has to be prioritized because the pandemic has hit the country such and the people such. But when we look at the third world countries at the global level, why do you see that they were not the entire healthcare infrastructure just crumbled and it was overwhelmed by the cases and by the non-availability of the vaccines, and then management structures that failed to actually cater to the emergency crisis that we have seen. So why do you look at it from the point of view of developing countries? Because that's an important part of the entire conversation that has to be there.
Yes. So when it comes to low income countries, I feel they were worst hit by the pandemic. And as I said, the example of countries in Africa struggling to give um, their people the first dose, where developed nations were giving a booster shot. That is because of several reasons. Number one, health has never been on the priority list for these countries. There are so many other priorities or so many other challenges that these countries face that health never comes as the topmost priority. But because of the pandemic, we are hopeful that more focus or more attention is going to be given on health. Second, and another major factor is lack of skills and manufacturing capabilities. Now, when you are solely dependent on other countries and exports for your drugs, for the drugs that your people consume for different kinds of health issues, or for the vaccines that your people consume, or for different therapeutics, then you are at a very, very vulnerable position where when health crisis such as this COVID-19 pandemic or any other health crisis of this magnitude happens, then say, for example, India would just try to cater to the needs of its own people first than exporting its vaccines to the countries in Africa. And that is exactly what happened. India tried to initially produce a lot of vaccines and then export it to other countries, but it realized that it needs more vaccine to cater to its own population first, and it had to stall the exports for a brief period of time. And those countries that used to receive vaccines from India, they also suffered a lot. So it means that there is a need to invest in skill development, in improving the manufacturing or the drug development scenario. And most importantly, it is imperative for every country, be it low, middle, or high income countries, to focus on research and development. That has come out as a major point to be, or factor to be considered, especially when you're dealing with healthcare. You face a health crisis, you do not face a health crisis. Research and development is very important in the health space. And had these countries had strong research and development wing, they would have been able to develop their own vaccines or own drugs and wouldn't have been depending on other countries. So this is another factor which I feel was responsible. And the fourth one is, of course, lack of funding and lack of investment in healthcare. This is a major factor which low income countries face, because they have so many other important issues, like just managing poverty, or say dealing with malnutrition, that they do not have the bandwidth to invest in strengthening, say, a health system, or to invest in setting up a strong and a robust data and monitoring system to track how many cases are being recorded. So these are certain factors which I feel played a critical role in why the low income countries could not sustain the pandemic, and their health system completely crumbled. Back to you, sir.
That's quite interesting. I mean, I have come across a lot of criticisms when it comes to, states that were dealing with the entire pandemic thing. But what impact did it have in the long term for women health wise? I mean, when you talk about a country like India, that is a model that has actually proven its merit when it comes to dealing with a crisis like that. And it was the country that put the entire administrative structures to deal with this kind of an emergency. That having been said, what was the side effect and the impact that this entire pandemic thing had on the children and women especially, because that's the central part of this conversation.
I think women and children have always kind of borne the brunt of any kind of crisis. Even before the pandemic, women and girls faced a lot of barriers in accessing safe and affordable healthcare. And because of the pandemic, there was interrupted health services. For example, a pregnant woman, if wanted to go for abortion, was not allowed to step out of the house because of the because of the lockdown at national level, but at the same time did not have access to, say, teleconsultancy, or did not have access to ashas or the ANMs nearby where they can seek help because of the socio-cultural barriers around such sensitive issues. Um, it is disturbing to actually think of the people, of the women and girls living in the rural areas when the lockdown was imposed. Just imagine how many women had to um, compromise their health, because it's not a new discussion that in India, especially in rural areas, women do not have agency over their own health. They do not have the decision making power of how many children they want, whether they want a child or not. It is the men, or say the mother-in-laws in the house, who are the sole decision makers. They make the decisions for the women, which is very unfortunate, but that is the fact. So when already women are dealing with such kind of socio-cultural barriers in accessing, say, sexual and reproductive health services, a pandemic only worsens the situation for them. There were so many reports that came out during the pandemic about how women could not access abortion services, family planning services. They could not take the child for immunization, for the vaccines that are a part of the national immunization program. A lot of children missed it. So, COVID, we often talk about the direct effect of COVID on health, how many people died, how many cases were reported. But what we're not realizing is the indirect impact of health, impact of the pandemic, not only on health, but on economy and several other factors, which we will realize at least 5 to 10 years from now. The people, the kids who have missed the immunization cycles, it's very difficult to get hold of them and ensure that they are put into the system again. What about the 2 years of delay in the routine and preventive care? What about the women who did not want to be pregnant in these 2 years, but were forced to be pregnant because they could not access family planning services or safe abortion services? And you also talk about gender-based violence. In these 2 years, the amount of cases that has been reported on gender-based violence because women were confined in the four walls of the house and were not able to step out of the house, all of these just show how vulnerable women and girls are, especially in rural area. In urban areas also, the case is really, the landscape is bad, but it is worse in rural areas. And it's not that because of pandemic, it has suddenly happened, but unfortunately it was there even before the pandemic, and it is going to continue post the pandemic as well, unless we empower women, unless we educate women, and we raise awareness.
That's a
Back
quite
to you.
fascinating account of the entire thing. But the thing will remain there that in the debates, like where we talk, where we earlier used to talk about women health, that has to be prioritized, because policy wise it was prudent, it was deemed fit that okay, this is the prudent step we can take, and in the larger scheme of things it will benefit and it will have a trickle down effect. That having been said, this pandemic had an impact on the psychology of the people. It will take quite 4 5 years more actually to let the things fall in line, to let the life return to the normal. And you have been working on family planning thing in African state Rwanda. So as a country or as a continent in Africa, where do you see healthcare discourse actually just shaping up because of the pandemic and post-pandemic world? Where do you think that the entire African continent will see? Is it like so uniform when we talked about earlier in the initial phase of this conversation that there was a global consensus, but there were also certain cases where countries were not actually getting access to the vaccines, and in the entire issue was raised at the UN, that the conference took place at that time in that year, especially 2020 2021. So when we talk largely about the continent like Africa, where do you see that the global powers can collaborate? Where do you see the lack of consensus actually coming into the lines, and it can hinder the larger perspective about healthcare discourse shaping in the African continent?
Okay, I would like to break this question into three parts. The first part being uh, me working in Rwanda. Just to correct that a little bit, so there's this international conference on family planning that happens every year. And in 2018, that conference happened in Rwanda, where I was selected as a youth leader from India to represent India and to share the voice of youth and how youth can play a significant role in improving the family planning landscape in India. So I do not have a very in-depth understanding of the health landscape in Rwanda per se, but I can definitely give you an insight from my experience of work in South Africa and Kenya. So what I personally feel is the health trajectory of India is quite similar to the health trajectory of Africa, especially countries like South Africa and Kenya. It's just that what India is today, they like what India was suffering from, say, 10 years or 15 years ago, Africa is at that position right now. But what the positive side of things are, India did not have access to, say, a teleconsultancy or a e-Sanjeevani app, or say a Ayushman Bharat initiative, or say health sector being prioritized at the global level 10 to 15 years back. But Africa today is seeing all of this happen. Africa today now knows what is the importance of manufacturing sector, drug development, research and development, uh, pushing or encouraging students to go for science education, now is witnessing all of this. And there is a huge difference in a country's position prior to the pandemic and now. So I feel while the health landscape in both India and Africa are similar, the difference is in the time lapse. We were there 10 years back, Africa is there now, but it has all of these avenues which could potentially accelerate its improvement and its progress in the health space, which is a very positive impact, I feel, of COVID.
Quite quickly, in the last part of this conversation, I'd like you to actually talk about your perspective when we talk about India as a success story, while dealing with the pandemic, and what post-pandemic world for India, for we Indians, will be like. What would be the things that have to be, as a policy advocate, you will suggest to the government and to the entire research fraternity that are actually talking and debating through and through about this entire discourse that's shaping up in India?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I recognize that we have 6 minutes, and I'll try to make it very quick. But for India, I would say that we have done commendable job in terms of tackling with the pandemic. When we compare India with other countries, I feel, yes, there were hiccups. Yes, there were gaps that were exposed. Yes, we struggled with because of our weak health infrastructure and but I think the way India came up to speed and has been able to manage the pandemic, especially the vaccination side of things, has been remarkable. Talking from the broader lens of how India has prioritized health, yes, we are doing great. We have come up with new initiatives. Ayushman Bharat is world's largest insurance, public health insurance scheme, and we have health and wellness centers. We have e-Sanjeevani app. All of these um, are in place, and more initiatives are coming, which shows that the government is willing to address the gaps that exist in the healthcare system and is prioritizing health. But there still remains couple of pillars, a couple of areas that kind of needs attention for India to do better. First, being investment. India still only contributes or allocates less than 2% of its budget to health. Whereas countries like China and USA, they allocate around 5% and 17% of their GDP to health. And it is unfortunate that even today, despite all of these initiatives that India has been taking, we rank 179 out of 189 countries when it comes to government's prioritization of health in its budget. So this needs to be fixed. Yes, philanthropies and private sector is investing in health right now, but we need to increase government expenditure so that the out-of-pocket expenditure can decrease from 65% to 35%. If we increase the budgetary allocation for health to at least 3 or 3.5% of GDP. So that is one area. The second area is data collection. India has historically had this problem of not having a robust health data collection or monitoring and evaluation system. Why is data required? It is required if you have to identify what are the gaps in a program, then you need data. And then that's where you identify what the gaps are. That's how you shape your policy level decisions. And that's why India needs a very robust and a strong mechanism to collect data and to analyze data, without which it is very difficult to come up with policies that will be impactful and will be effective. The third thing I feel that India needs to focus on is building a future-ready health system where we have hospitals in place, but at the same time, we have manpower, we have skilled professionals who can actually use these hospitals to provide quality care, quality services to its people. So that's the third point. The fourth point I feel is technology. Yes, India is doing great with telecommunications, but we need more. There is scope for improvement, and COVID has shown the immense impact that tele consultation and technology can play in health sector. So that is something that probably India can look forward to in exploring. And the last one would be public-private partnership. We saw what collaboration can do between government and the private sector. So we need more of those in every aspect of health, and especially in research and development and diagnostics. I think these are the primary main pillars where India needs to invest more in, needs to prioritize more, and needs to focus more if we need to like sort of strengthen our health system so that we are better prepared for any health crisis of this magnitude.